Hi folks, welcome to Crisco's Corner. Are you tired of the same old blah 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 from the media? Do you like unfiltered commentary? Would you like to go back to the days when our rights meant something? Well, you've come to the right place, Crisco's Corner. The fight to get back the ideals of our founders will be long and hard. Please support the channel by subscribing. And as always, thank you for your support. Hi folks, welcome to Crisco's Corner from KSAT.com. That's a TV station in San Antonio, Texas, the great state of Texas. I was in Texas several times when I used to live in Utica. I'm still in upstate New York in Binghamton. And when I lived in Utica, I flew down there with a good friend of mine, Joe Luch. He worked for Utica Mutual Insurance, and he used to get tickets to the Cowboy game. It was always the third week in October, and it was a night game, and I've been to Dallas several times and Houston once. Oddly enough, I ran into a guy I knew in Houston from my hometown here in Binghamton who I thought was hotter than hell, but that's another story for another time. Texas Secession bill formally filed in state legislature. Representative Kyle Bitterman's proposal will allow for referendum on Texas secession. Now, this has been talked about for a long time. It's something that's been threatened, especially by the more red states, and they're getting redder by the day, except for Virginia, which has turned purple, I guess. But the thought of it is getting more and more, I would say, real. Is it close to being a reality? No. But it's a lot closer than it was. Let's read the story. After weeks of touting his secession bill on social media, State Representative Kyle Bitterman, Republican from Fredericksburg, well, a huge Confederate win there and a huge Union blunder in the Civil War at Fredericksburg, formally filed the proposed legislation on Friday, which will give Texans a chance to explore opting out of the Union in referendum. Bitterman began talking about the potential Texit, as they call it, in early December. Remember, there was Brexit when the England left the European Union. In other words, British exit. This is Texas exit. In early December, saying it's his response to a federal government that is out of control, does not represent the value of Texans. It doesn't represent the values of, probably 48% of the country are basically invisible as far as these Democrats are concerned, especially the progressives and the leftists. The news release published after he filed the bill, Bitterman said HB 1359 would not allow for immediate independence, but would create a referendum that, if approved, will lead to a creation of a committee to develop a plan for secession. What's going on here? He's putting his toe in the water. He's putting his toe in the water just to see what Texans think. For decades, the promises of America and our individual liberties have been eroding, Bitterman said in a statement. It is now time that the people of Texas are allowed the right to decide their own future. This is not a left or right political issue. Let Texans vote. In theory, I have no problem with it. The bill is unlikely to pass and has already been rebuked by fellow Republicans, including Representative Jeff Leach. Seems like the most anti-American bill I've seen in my 4 terms in the Texas House. And there's a few others that, take offense to it. Wow, last night alone, we received over 3,000 petition signatures, making over 12,000. I'm grateful for the support. This is the Texas representative that's putting, of course, the bill. Texans have wondered about secession before, but in reality, it's very unlikely to occur. It would not only be controversial, but potentially illegal. And therein lies the rub. In 1868, the Supreme Court maintained that Texas is an indissoluble relation when it became part of the United States. Bitterman is no stranger to controversy, and then it says some of the dumb crap that he did. Dressed up as a gay Hitler at Halloween and asked Muslims to, if they support terrorist groups. That's bat crap, crazy stuff, I admit. But we're talking about the subject itself. Now, oddly enough, at least what I've read, and now I'm not a expert on the Civil War era, late 19th century America at all. But my understanding is at the end of the Civil War, when Jefferson Davis was jailed, they supposedly were going to hang him for treason and put him on trial. If I remember correctly, he spent several years in prison, but they never tried him. They released him, and he ended up living off of a rich widow for the rest of his life. She took him in and spent his life there, and he wrote his classic, which I've never read, but it would be very interesting to read, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate States. Why didn't he go to jail? Why wasn't he tried for treason? Why wasn't Robert E. Lee tried for treason? He was the most, we'll say, not outspoken, but most popular Confederate, North and South. He ended up taking the oath. He encouraged millions of others to when they re-entered the Union. Virginia did. I mean, because back then your states were your country. And after the Civil War, how did Shelby Foote, the old Civil War historian, put it? Before the Civil War, the United States are. And after the Civil War, the United States is. It took 600,000 deaths and over 1 million plus wounded and crippled to make an R into an is. It doesn't sound like much, but it is a big deal because the state as your country started eroding after that. You were still loyal to your state, but not like before the war. To go back to what I was saying, why wasn't Lee, Davis, any of those tried for treason, at least put on trial for sedition, anything? The answer is they couldn't figure out what crime they broke. Leaving the Union was never tried before. It was talked about in New England, believe it or not, a few years prior to that. New England was going to secede. It never happened, of course, but remember that was the nest of rebels was in New England. And I guess after the country was formed, I don't recall, I think it was taxation, I'm not sure, why New England wanted to secede from the Union. And then I believe the court ruled, I believe it was in the 1880s or 1890s. I'm a little vague on that. They ruled that seceding from the Union was unconstitutional and illegal. But there was no set law. Nobody said you couldn't leave. They saw it as a marriage. And the marriage isn't working out, so they want out. If one side wants out of a marriage, there's not much the other side can do. Ask all the divorced people, they'll tell you. Sometimes it's amicable, sometimes it's one-sided. And of course, when it's one-sided, it gets really ugly, just like the real American Civil War. It's an interesting concept, to be sure. Now, I read a couple of comments here. It is fitting that the conversation is originating in San Antonio, the cradle of Texas liberty. It's just a referendum to see what the people of Texas think. Nothing wrong with that. They go on a few other ones. This is an individual I find interesting. He put an interesting comment. Political rules and policies are limited. This article is something for young, uneducated voters and or those with really short memories, limited knowledge, and a wild imagination. Now, I think that's a little hyperbolic. Uneducated voters. You can have, I know some people that have very little formal education that are extremely smart, and I know a lot of educated idiots. The corruption of America's blue states will be dealt with at the ballot box at the midterms. Well, that's what we thought was going to happen in 2020. Can't go into too much detail here on YouTube, but that's what they thought would happen. Two truths. Stacey Abrams will get caught. I believe that to be true. And two, Texas will never succeed. Maybe he means secede, maybe he means both. Since the Alamo and San Juanito, Texas have become a bastion for patriots that are willing to die for life, liberty, and the American dream. The leftist coup will be ended at the ballot box with voter ID. I believe that to also be true. But it's really interesting. Really interesting. It's a vote. not an armed uprising yet. Of course, if the Second Amendment is threatened, who voted this fool in? Yeah, the guy's next, like what I would call a stand-up Republican, but we're talking about the bill rather than the man who submitted it. It's very interesting concept. And as things become darker blue and darker red, I think, now granted, we've got a lot of steps before that happens, but I personally think we're walking towards it. Now, if you remember from the 1840s, 1820s, really, the Missouri Compromise was everything they could to keep the Union together. At least stop the southern states from rebelling. And, of course, the main issue was slavery. And all kinds of deals were made. One state in the north, one state in the south, one state in the west, one state in the south to keep the balance of power so the southern states would not rebel. And that clicked along until, and they kicked the can down the road. And I think this is the beginning of kicking the can down the road. Now, with the election of 1860 and election of Lincoln, the powder keg was sitting there. And that was the match that blew it up. And it happened quick. I believe South Carolina was first. I don't recall what order they seceded in. And it went bang, 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 bang. In fact, the day that Virginia voted, which was really late in the secession movement, they were towards the end. Robert E. Lee was offered the command of the Union Army to quell the rebellion. And he said no, of course, because his country was Virginia, which was right across the river from Washington. And Arlington, the place where he lived, it was his wife's estate. It's now Arlington National Cemetery. They made it to a cemetery so Lee could never, ever live there again. But I digress. He said no. And when Virginia seceded, he went with her because Virginia was his country. And that's the way it was seen back then. And for a lot of the red states, and as these Democrats, I'm telling you, they're doing it, and they're doing it, I don't know if they realize it. The more they alienate, the more they censor, the more they call names, racist, all kinds of vile stuff to every Trump supporter, every Republican, every conservative person, it's digging them in deeper. It's digging them in deeper until they're going to just pop. They're not going to budge. And you ignoring them, or if you don't ignore them, you call them names, it's not going to help. So let's take a look at here what it would look like, I think, in my opinion, if some secession did start. Let's take a look at the map. And here we have a map of basically the old Confederacy, at least in part. I added Oklahoma, Kentucky, and West Virginia, which was part of Virginia, but in the middle of the war, the North made them into a state because they were more pro-Union. And of course, you see D.C. there, which is stuck between Maryland and Virginia. And the rest of those were all the states that did secede. Now, the part that's interesting, if you look through the Midwest, I did add Oklahoma because I think they would secede as well if it happened. But what about Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho? I think they would jump in a hurry, which would split the country. Now, Utah's in a tough spot. Utah is stuck between the West Coast, California, Nevada, Arizona, with Colorado on the other side. Could they also secede? But that would be an odd defensive position if a war ever broke out. I think Utah would kind of get screwed, to be honest with you, and would be stuck. And then you have the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and the entire Northeast. Now, to give you an idea, if you follow my cursor, I live right about here, just across the border in New York and above the Pennsylvania line in a place called Binghamton, New York. It's about right there, I think, given a guess. Pretty close. Give you people an idea if you know where Syracuse is. Syracuse is right here. Albany is up here. And, of course, this is Long Island. And, of course, there's Manhattan, and New York City is right here, which basically runs the state. Interesting enough, though, I don't think people knew this. I believe Delaware was a slave state back in the 1860s. Maryland, I'm pretty sure, but I don't recall offhand. But I know Delaware was. So, Joe Biden, get off your holier-than-thou attitude about reparations. Your state of Delaware was a former slave state, so you know what? Just keep your opinions to yourself about former slave states, because the war is long over and people have long changed. But here's the interesting part. It's unlawful, they say, and illegal, unconstitutional, to leave the United States. What would happen if all the states there in red, and then we'll say all the states with the blue lines on them as well, across the Midwest and up through the Dakotas and Montana and Idaho and Wyoming? I know there's talk about Eastern Oregon wanting to join Idaho, and Northern California wanting to join Idaho, and Southern Oregon. That way Idaho would basically come here, and then across, and so they would have a connection to the ocean. There's talk about that right now, and this is way closer in steps to actually seceding. Is it smarter just to move the state lines? Would it make it more red, more blue? But it gets to a point where there's just nowhere to move the lines. So I think if this did happen, I think it would be an interesting concept if all the states with the red slashes and all the states with the blue that went with them said, you know what? We are the United States. We want all the rest of you to leave the United States. Interesting. There's no constitutional law. There's no case law that I know of that if the majority of states in the United States, or a huge swath of land in the United States, wants the other states to leave the United States, I don't think there's a law against that. So there might be, it's interesting thing to talk about. But it's getting to this point now, and that gentleman said in the comments, this will be all solved in the elections in 2022. I'm not so sure. I think the Republicans will take the House and the Senate. The Senate not by much, but they'll get a pretty good advantage in the House. And it'll be gridlock, which is fine. I'd rather have gridlock than things go crap. And then 2024, of course, will be the huge battleground. But to even talk about this now, it's always been talked about, but to talk about it in such out in the open on major television networks and social media, cable news networks, this isn't the talk of some tinfoil hat kooks anymore. There's really legitimate, honest Americans that say maybe it's time for an amicable divorce. It'd be sad, but to be honest with you, if it did happen, I'd have to leave New York. I'd have to leave here, and I'd have to travel all the way through here, and I'd probably live about right here. Crossville, Tennessee. I've been there. It's a nice town. It's a beautiful place. Old school manners, old school ways. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, sir. I'd be called Mr. John, and I would call you Miss Alice if that was your name. Very old school, formal, but modern at the same time. So that would be where I would go if that happened. But it's something to talk about. It's something interesting. Will it get legs? I'm 64. I doubt if it will happen in my lifetime. Maybe it will. We'll have to see. But just like in 1850, they didn't know in 10 years the two sides of the United States would be at war, a real war with each other. They didn't know it was coming. And when it happened this quick. And nothing could stop it once it started. So we'll see. And until next time, folks, goodbye and good luck.